Hi, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to all of you. It's great to have all of you here at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington as we undertake our panel, Kuwait Between Mediation and Maximum Pressure. It's really such a pleasure to be able to focus on Kuwait for this panel, but of course looking at Kuwait also in the context of the region and in the changing global politics. Very happy to see all of you here, and thank you for bearing with us and coming at our changed time. I know we're also going to be live streaming this event, so I welcome all of you that are not here but are following us. And I believe we have a hashtag for the event, right? Kuwait, is that right? Hashtag Kuwait. Very simple, if you would like to comment on the event. I wanted to talk just a little bit about Kuwait before I introduce my esteemed panelists. We have a really fantastic panel today, and why we're especially pleased, like I said, to have this one session just devoted in thinking about Kuwait and its role and what Kuwait might be able to tell us for this changing region. As we all know, Kuwait's a really strong ally of the United States, especially since the Gulf War and its liberation in the 1990, hosts an important military base. Kuwait's always been a very strong supporter of both regional and international institutions, including both, of course, the Gulf Cooperation Council and the United Nations. Probably as well, Kuwait's stance has a lot to do as well with its security situation and looking to regional institutions and international law to help secure itself and gain that kind of regional and international support. Kuwait's known for playing a really important role in international aid, as demonstrated recently in its hosting of the Iraq Reconstruction Conference. And the Emir has been recognized by the UN for his leadership in humanitarian issues. And of course, regionally, I think Kuwait's probably best known for its very vibrant political society and also vocal politics through probably certainly the most substantial elected body in the Gulf, Kuwait's parliament. Nonetheless, it's probably fair to say that Kuwait has lagged behind some of its regional peers in terms of its economic diversification, even some of the kind of big infrastructure building that we saw across the region. We saw a bit less of that, or they've been a bit slower to come to the table in some of that, despite its considerable wealth. And that might be changing, though, as we see a kind of renewed determination in Kuwait for the Kuwait 2035 vision, which has been rebranded now as New Kuwait. I think it's fair to say then if you think about Kuwait and all of these issues and both its regional and domestic politics, it's a country that really tries to balance a number of interests, both between different regional parties and regional and also domestic interests. And I think one big question before all of us is to think about how that kind of Kuwaiti mode of balancing is faring in a Gulf, which I wrote about recently, is turning in a much more maximalist direction, also from the U.S. administration. So I think we have a lot of really interesting questions to delve into in looking at Kuwait today in this panel. And luckily we have just a really amazing panel of experts to take on all of these different questions. To the left of me, I have Dr. Abdullah Alshayji. Dr. Alshayji is both a professor at Kuwait University and former chairman and is the director of the Political Science Graduate Program. He's very well known in Kuwait, both as a scholar and a commentator, and especially as well, more recently for your discussion of American politics, which you've become very well known. So I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about the current American posture in the region, what it means for Kuwait from Dr. Abdullah. It's been a pleasure to know him for many years. I think I first met you when I was doing my dissertation, which I'm not going to date, because I would date myself. But it's been a long time, and I've always just really enjoyed his presence, often a provocative presence that brings a lot deeper understanding once you get into those issues, which he forces you to get into, which is a good thing. And we also have Ambassador Deborah Jones, who's a former U.S. ambassador to both Libya and Kuwait. Ambassador Jones is someone who I've really turned to a lot in trying to understand Kuwait, and have been always extremely impressed with both her kind of personal insights and connections that she made with Kuwaitis, both at kind of a high level and within society. And I'm really looking forward to hearing her comments. And I'm sure she's a very, very active commentator too. So it'll be interesting to hear her and Dr. Alshayji undertake these issues sitting side by side. Maybe I should have put you in the middle, Ambassador Ziadeh. And also, we're fortunate to have another ambassador, Susan Ziadeh, who is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Peninsula Affairs. And she also served as ambassador to Qatar. And she has just some really deep insights from that long experience serving in the Gulf. She also served in Kuwait, I must mention. So she has that role as well. So it brings a really profound regional perspective from sitting in these different seats across the Gulf. So with that, I think maybe why don't we just get started? And I thought just to get some initial ideas on the table, we could start with like a lightning round where each of you in just a couple minutes can tell me what you think are Kuwait's kind of biggest challenge that they face today, or maybe the biggest challenge, not a number because we'll do a lot and each of you will have a chance. So just throw out an idea of what you think Kuwait's biggest challenge is and maybe what one of Kuwait's assets or strengths are that they bring to the table in facing this changing regional situation. So Dr. Alshayji, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you, Kristin. Good afternoon, everybody. And once again, I think this is my first invitation as a panelist, but I've been here before, attended, I think, one of the talks a few years ago. I'm glad to be here, and I also thank you for being able to reschedule the event because of circumstances beyond our means took place last week. So I'm glad that we made it, and I'm glad that also my co-panelists have been able to reschedule, and I'm glad to see a lot of my friends and colleagues in this room. And I thank also the Arab Gulf states in Washington for the wonderful job they are doing. I'm a believer of having more think tanks and institutes in this town to discuss and to build a bridge between our both societies, countries, states, and in order to have a better understanding for our region and what make us different or what make us the way we are. Kuwait, and I thank you also for the panel on Kuwait, which is something very relevant for us. Kuwait has been, in my opinion, since the end of the Cold War and the crisis of the occupation, of the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait and the liberation almost 30 years ago, its model of benign intervention and its model of foreign aid donor and to play the maximalist role of using its wealth not only for its own well-being and its citizens, but also for other Arab countries and Muslim countries and even beyond through the Arab economic, the Fund for Arab Economic Development has been really a major branding of Kuwait. Kuwait is different. Kuwait plays major powers. Kuwait perfected the balancing act model of playing the Russians against the Americans when the Americans refused or were hesitant under the Reagan administration to protect or to the Kuwaiti oil tankers in the 1987 or the Iraq-Iran war. The Kuwaitis went to the Russians, and then the Americans came along and protected the whole Kuwaiti fleet of oil tankers. So Kuwait was a maverick, and Kuwait punched over its belt or its weight, and has been able really to secure some kind of a niche and unique position in its neighborhood. We had the first elected parliament, the first constitution, with the first universities, the masrah, the play, the theater. Kuwait has been looked upon as the soft power and the California of the Gulf at that era. The golden era. Even Kuwait diplomacy under the patronage of, or the leadership of the Kuwaiti current Emir, who served for almost 40 years as foreign minister and cultivated a lot of friendship among later on world leaders, also gave Kuwait some kind of an advantage over other GCC states who looked at Kuwait as the city by the hill that everybody wants to emulate. Now all of that really is under heavy stress. We have the Iraqi occupation, we have the end of the Cold War, we have the Iraq war to topple Saddam Hussein, and that really removed the existential threat that Kuwait faced for a long time. Now what's in the mind of many Kuwaitis is domestic issue, domestic reforms, diversification of the economy, the new Kuwait 2035. Is it a real thing, or it is something that is really far-fetched a dream? Jobs. Many Kuwaitis now, and a couple of weeks ago, we saw engineering students, fresh graduate, demonstrating before the oil ministry building on the Arabian Gulf Street, which is who've been to Kuwait, they know it's the major street by the Gulf, demonstrating, demanding jobs. And these are fresh graduates. Some of them have been 1 or 2 years graduated from, some of them, American universities, from Kuwait University, and they want job in the oil sector. And Kuwait depends 90% of its income or of its budget comes from petrodollar. So the issue of also, in my opinion, now there is a rife, the issue of sectarianism that is the resultant of the Iraqi situation. The blunder by the President Bush, 43. We pay the price until now, the toppling of Saddam Hussein that allowed Iran to be the hegemonic dominant power in the region, and spreading sectarianism. Tribalism is also on the rise, and Kuwaiti nationalism, Kuwaitization of Kuwaitis, and we have some MPs who are pushing the populism rod here, and all these issues on top of a highly educated, well-connected youth. The youth bulge, 70% of Kuwait is under 30 years old. And these people have wide dreams. These people have been exposed to the X generation and the millennial generation. And all these people are highly educated, sophisticated, well-traveled. And you cannot really, they cannot settle for less than what they are demanding. So all these challenges are being put on a government and a system that is really need to overhaul itself. Plus the bickering and fighting within the Kuwaiti political system is becoming really paralyzing Kuwait. It's not making Kuwait advancing in a way that we would like to see. As we speak now, the parliament is grilling 2 ministers now, right now. And if that's not enough, a Kuwaiti member of parliament just submitted a couple of hours ago interpellation and grilling for the prime minister. This notion is considered to be an alien concept for our neighbors in the GCC states. How could you grill members of the ruling family and even the prime minister, who is number 4 in the ranking in the political system, by an elected body? But at the end of the day, it accomplishes very little. And it hinders Kuwait development, it hinders Kuwait, the view from outside to Kuwait that Kuwait is not good to do business with. There is paralysis, there is malaise, there is high expectations and low productivity. And because of that, a new thinking, I think, is now overdue to try to pull out Kuwait. Kuwait has a lot of potential, a lot of soft power, a lot of highly educated people, a lot of honest and serious people who would love to see Kuwait be different than it is today. But this needs a lot of involvement, and this needs a lot of action by all sides, not only by one side or one organization or one part of the government and not the others. So maybe we can talk more about that during this panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you. You gave us a lot of challenges. between jobs, a number of isms, sectarianism, tribalism, nationalism, populism, the youth bulge and youth ambitions, and how all of this works together in Kuwait's political system. You did give us one asset that Kuwait has, though, which is its soft power and its very well-educated people. So that's one thing to take forward, the positive thing, that they can work with all of these challenges. Ambassador Jones, did you find another challenge in there that Dr.
Well,
Alshayji
actually,
didn't cover?
I was because there were so many challenges. I was going to start with what I think the strength of Kuwait is, one of the great strengths, and that is precisely the fact that it does have a highly educated population, highly sophisticated and well-traveled, well-educated, very conversant with the way the world works, with many connections everywhere. And also, it is a highly intimate society where Kuwaitis know each other. They feel a very real sense of family, even though there are fights within that dysfunctional family sometimes. But the fact of the matter is that Kuwait ends up being incredibly transparent by comparison to some of the other places in the region. And I'll cite one example of that, which was when the JICPOA, when the agreement on Iran was signed, and there was so much unhappiness in many places. There was frankly, at the time when I was in the government still, there was only one country where there was not light between what the politicians had said, or the leadership had said publicly, and what they were saying privately, and that was Kuwait. And that's quite simply because you can't get away with that there, too. I mean, there is a parliament, there is an exchange, there is frustration, and the parliament is a challenge. I'll get into the challenges here in a minute. But the fact that you have this kind of human resource asset there and a sense of family and the wealth that you have can help you, and the tradition you have of making deals, of co-opting, of the soft power, the experience with soft power you have. Now, let's shift to the challenges here. And go. We always used to joke that Kuwait was between Iraq and a hard spot. And that is so true because geography makes so much of a difference in how any country operates and how they see themselves. I'm going to suggest that one of the biggest challenges that Kuwait is going to face in this next period is the absence of clear policies coming from the United States of America. And because Kuwait has always managed to understand and to play against what they know is that kind of, what I call it in some ways, it's the liberating form, but it's the outlines that they could rely on from a superpower who does own a base there, who can be very disruptive, but at the same time is there, is kind of predictable. Even when you didn't like what we had to say, it was predictable. And it was something that Kuwaitis could even say, well, we would rather not do this, but the United States has this position, so we kind of have to do this. And so it gave a certain leeway in a certain way for Kuwait to take actions that perhaps were not always so popular with its people or with others. The fact that the United States is now, or the administration has proven itself to be extraordinarily transactional, and will make deals, for example, speaking to two other OPEC members, to the Saudis and the UAE, reportedly, and I have to say all of this reportedly because, of course, again, I'm not in the government, which is why I can say these things to begin with. But, you know, without taking into consideration Kuwait's needs or Kuwait's concerns about this, that's very troubling. And the fact that you almost seem to have an attitude that is rather cynical on the part of the United States, which is that we don't really let these guys sort stuff out on their own because, you know what, it doesn't really matter to us that much. I mean, I think that both Presidents Obama and Trump both recognized very clearly the fatigue in the United States among the American people for continual involvement and engagement in places that seem to be having all kinds of problems and conflicts all the time. The difference was perhaps that naively on Obama's part, it was to try to get the international community more engaged, to say, you know, they can take a bigger role in kind of dealing with all of these things, which proved not to be very effective in Libya and other places. But I think on the Trump, I'm not sure I yet fully understand what the position is of this administration, which seems to be, you know what, leave it alone. It doesn't affect us immediately, and these guys are going to have to knock it out amongst themselves, and we'll wait to see who comes out on top, and we'll deal with them then. And I think that, with the kind of the breakdown within the GCC, presents a very fragile, a very troubling situation for Kuwait to deal with. I think on the economic side, all these other things that Abdullah mentioned, we're seeing here: tribalism, nationalism, populism, sectarianism. This may just be the zeitgeist of this age, and it's and maybe we're just in the. It's kind of like the meteor hitting the Earth, and the dinosaurs are going to have to disappear at some point. I'm not sure, but I do think that the other issue has been in Kuwait, and something that we got hit on WikiLeaks, was that we had written a cable while I was there that was touted by the Islamists of all people, by the Muslim Brothers and some others, which was that that if Kuwait, we just did an actuarial study. We said, here is a country that is dependent almost wholly on oil money. It has a demographic that's, it's 6.8% growth at the time, youth population. It's a social welfare state. It has some serious medical problems, very much like the United States, heart disease and diabetes related to obesity. And all paid for by the state. So we said, okay, if you just do the math and you say oil revenues, declining oil prices, lack of foreign direct investment, lack of job creation, lack of economic stimulus, growing health concerns that the government is going to have to pay for, by the time you roll to 2020, you have the equivalent of a 401k for most Kuwaitis. Well, so this was distorted. WikiLeaks came out, and somebody got hold of it and retranslated that into a very bad Arabic. By the way, I remember it was Mr. Bodai, I think, and it came out saying the U.S. ambassador said Kuwait is going to disappear by 2020. And what was the plotting of the Americans here? And I said, well, of course, because I am.
That is next year.
Exactly. So I'm going to have to travel to Kuwaiti on that thing. But so I do think that kind of diversification, the kinds of things that we heard from the finance minister when he was here about the program 2035, building, developing, creating jobs, all those things, that is the other major challenge for Kuwait, is to really make it possible for Kuwaitis to stay in Kuwait, to work in Kuwait, and again, I do think in some funny ways, as the Chinese say, I mean, the same character is for challenge as opportunity, and I think that opportunity maybe may kick in on some of these things. So we'll see.
Great, thank you, Deborah. So you've introduced in addition to the economic challenges, the challenge coming from here, from Washington, of unclear policies or maybe different kind of leadership coming from the United States. So we'll definitely be picking that one up again, I think. Ambassador Ziadeh?
Well, a lot has been said, so there really isn't too much for me to add. I like being on this end of the table. It works really very well. There are a couple of things, though, that I would like to note. In terms of strengths, and I think this is open for debate, and I acknowledge that, but I'm looking at this with a longer view. The fact that I was always struck when I served in Kuwait, and every time I went back, which was regularly in the 14 years that I served in the Gulf, that Kuwait has such a vibrant civil society. They have civil society groups that are long-standing. They're organized around different themes, different groupings. They're integrated, different types of peoples, mixed gender, mixed even economic levels, to the extent there is stratification in Kuwait, and there is some. And I've always felt that they had the ability to raise issues, to test theories, to take steps that even the government maybe couldn't take, but to do it in a personal, more small capacity, in ways that could be a litmus test for future steps that that they could suggest to the government or to look at. It certainly is a freewheeling media. I was the public affairs officer, was there, so Jassim and these others were my regular stops, and they certainly were a source of tremendous information, not all of it always accurate. But the fact is that if you look at the Arab world historically in the last, I would say 40 years, The most freewheeling press is in Kuwait. And I would have to say that is true until today. A lot is made historically of like Beirut and other other Middle Eastern capitals, but Kuwait really, I think, has proved itself in a very time-tested way. Now, why do I focus on civil society and media? And of course, the parliament with its issues of sometimes, I remember in other countries in the Gulf, no, we don't want a parliament like Kuwait because that means things can't get done. That was the general refrain, la 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 la, ma bidna. I mean, I used to hear this all the time. That said, if you look at some of the issues that have been raised historically in the last 8-9 years in the whole Arab region, from North Africa, Egypt, the Levant, and into the Gulf, the voice of the people, the ability to influence and shape the discussion and even legislation and be able to provide a voice for the people through different avenues, whether it's civil society organizations, the media, the parliament. Kuwait has always had that. And I think that going forward, where unfortunately in countries across Europe and even in the United States and others where we seem to be moving in a more nationalistic authoritarian view, we know that that is a short-term solution and not a long-term strategy for how you build a strong economy, how you integrate the talent in your country, how you diversify an economy that allows all your citizens to participate, to feel they have a place in the table, to feel their government looks out for their interests and protects them. So the fact that you have these strong institutions, even now, can sometimes seem a bit of a hindrance. I really would argue that in the long run, will actually serve Kuwait in a way that will allow it to withstand some of the turbulence that the region historically has been subject to. So I throw that out as actually a strength. In terms of challenges, I think all of this was very well articulated. The only thing that I would add, and this is, I know, a little bit sensitive, and I'm not making any judgment on it, but the fact that you have a leader who has been the leader and a foreign minister for so many years in Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmed, the emir, a statesman, somebody who's respected in the region, someone whose role in mediation, in bringing parties together, in trying to tamp down tensions, not just in the GCC, but throughout the region. He's played an extraordinary role and is very well respected. So what happens when, unfortunately, he may no longer be on the scene, and who are in the pipeline to then step up? There's a lot of talent in Kuwait. There are a lot of very capable individuals within the government, within different entities, and certainly within the ruling family. So, but the question will be, is how does a new leadership look at Kuwait and situate Kuwait, position it vis-a-vis not just its domestic, but even more importantly, its foreign policy? Will it continue some of the policies that have been developed by Sabah al-Ahmed in terms of mediation, in terms of the use of humanitarian assistance as a way of developing relationships across the Middle East, across Asia and Africa? And how will Kuwait understand its role and position itself in an increasingly potentially divisive GCC and with the continued threats in the region?
Thank you, Ambassador. So that was great. You managed to come up with some new challenges and assets even at the end. Especially focused on the asset of Kuwait, maybe a kind of a slow strategy of development, and also the importance of the Kuwaiti leadership and how that will turn in the coming years. I think, why don't we start then from the outside and picking up on some of these themes, thinking about the regional and international situation in which Kuwait finds itself. And I think we'll start then with Ambassador Jones' point about the United States and the new leadership that we have here in the United States, and the clear shifting policies that we see as we see both a more assertive leader, and I think we can talk about that most strongly in the posture, completely flipped posture towards Iran, which might be a topic we want to pick up on. but also a United States that, as you said, maybe is stepping back and allowing others to play a more prominent role within the region as well. So we could also look at it in terms of sort of an increasing multilateralism in the region of a lot of different actors having a say instead of that role that Kuwait has always relied upon of being a strong ally to the United States. So Dr. Abdullah, do you want to start us in kind of thinking about, in particular, the Trump administration and the kind of challenge that his shifting positions have played for Kuwait?
This is an issue that's really compounding the security dilemma, in my opinion. And I'm writing now a book on the doctrines of U.S. presidents vis-a-vis the GCC and the Gulf region. But before I plunge into that, I'd like also to highlight the positive. I did not talk about positive issues of Kuwait, the soft power. I just skimmed through it. It's very relevant to talk about how Kuwait is viewed in the region as a benign interventionist, as a donor country, as a mediation player, with a lot of respect for the Emir of Kuwait personally, the wise man of the Arab world, as now he's being called, deservedly so. And as the safety valve for Kuwaitis, in my opinion, he is the main player in Kuwaiti politics, and his steadfast position vis-a-vis the GCC to keep this project alive, even though it is in an intensive care unit at this stage. But we're hoping and praying that a miracle will take place and something will, rational approach would prevail and cooler head would prevail, and we will be pulled out from this, as I call it in my recently published book, the self-inflicted wound by the GCC country from within. And this is the view of Kuwait, that the pet project of the GCC is a Kuwaiti project in essence, with the Emiratis, Sheikh Jabir al-Ahmed and Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan engineered this project, and the sentimental value of this project and the strategic value of this project has not really come to fruition. It has failed as a defensive mechanism and as a security alliance or alliance of some sort of balancing Iraq and Iran. We failed at that stage. But still, a working, viable GCC is one of the scenarios that the Emir is really pushing from day one since the crisis, the GCC crisis between Qatar on one hand and the Saudi Arabia and UAE in particular, along with the Bahrain and Egypt. Kuwait from day one was involved by His Highness Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmed, and until today. It's a labyrinth project. Here I will juxtapose the Trump administration. The feeling of retrenchment and abdication started with the Obama administration, with his cautious realism and leading from behind strategy in the region and in Libya in particular, and then escalated with the Trump administration, America first and make America great again, and taunting all the time during Make America Great rallies. The last one was last Saturday in Wisconsin. The GCC countries and Saudi Arabia in particular to pay for your protection. And this really rubs into the issue of credibility. I always argue, there is a trust deficit and underappreciation by the United States for its trustworthy U.S. allies who don't cost U.S. taxpayers, you guys, a penny. We foot the bill, 100%. From Arif Jan, the largest U.S. base for its army in the Middle East, with 11,000 to 13,000 U.S. soldiers, with pre-positioning equipment. We built it. We turned the key to the Americans. And nobody's talking about that. And this serves U.S. CENTCOM strategy in the region, not to protect Kuwait. And many Kuwaitis don't know that. And when I say that in Kuwait, they were shocked. And some of them are officials. Qatar gave Al-Udeid Air Base, the largest that you run all your wars in the region from it. As-Siliya and Al-Udeid in Afghanistan, Operation Inherent Resolve, Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Afghanistan Freedom. It's U.S. CENTCOM, 27 countries. And we never heard an appreciation from Obama or the Trump administration. Only we hear pay, pay, pay. Pay as you play. Pay as you go. This really does not bode well with a strategic alliance. On the other hand, I never heard President Trump or Obama say the same thing about Israel. You put $3.8 billion a year from your taxpayers' money to the Israelis. Why? $38 billion, 10 years. Obama did it before he left office. And Trump gave them on top of that Jerusalem and gave them the Golan Heights, and now we're going to give them probably the West Bank. And this really plays against the interests of the United States, the establishment, and against United States allies who condemned all of them, the Kuwaitis, the Saudis, the Emiratis, everybody, in different levels of condemnation, such move. Then you come and you pull out from Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Then you label the Iranian Revolutionary Guards terrorist organization. Then today, New York Times labeling the Ikhwan al-Muslimin a terrorist, foreign terrorist organization, FTO. Wow. This is a wrecking play in action. I mean, where would it stop? And you saw the anti-Semitic caricature in the New York Times the other day. Netanyahu is a guide dog leading blind President Trump. So all of this does not build up a trust in the United States. On top of that, when you read well-established authors who just published the last couple of years very, very important books, if you have not read them, please, I urge you to read them. Richard Haas, he's a Republican, huh? Was number 3 under under President Bush, 43 for the first 2 years. Planning, huh? Under Secretary for Planning. He wrote a very good book, A World in Disarray, about the retrenchment of United States and what does that mean to the rest of the world. Then you have Ivo Dadler and Jim Lindsay, who wrote a very excellent book last year, The Empty Throne, and how United States is destroying the world that it has built post-World War II and allowing all this chaos and mayhem to take place when it abdicates and it retrenches and it pivots towards domestic and make America great and internal issues. And now we see a dysfunctional Washington. Talk about impeachment and talk about Republicans and Democrats and Joe Biden and Sleepy Joe and all these issues that really give us a lot of anxiety and worry. You have it already in this town. But I'm talking about how do we view it and how your allies view the U.S. dysfunctional system at this stage here. And then the last book by Bernard Levy about the Empire and Five Kings, that you have the rise, the retrenchment of United States, and the rise of the 5 old civilizations, the Russians, the Chinese, the Persians, the Islamic right, or the Islamic fundamentalist groups. And all of that really leaves multilateralism, the Russians, the Chinese with their One Belt, One Road initiative to try to really fill up that vacuum on your expense with their intentions and with their interests. So I would argue that the United States, what it does and what it does not do, leave a major indelible marks on the relationship with its GCC allies. And that this limit also the maneuverability of Kuwait and other countries, especially Kuwait, is really between, as the ambassador said, between Iraq and I call it a hard place. How do we maneuver? I mean, even Kuwait clashed with the United States last year in the United Nations Security Council between our ambassador there Al-Utaibi and the departing U.S. ambassador over the protection of the Palestinian people and over Jerusalem as the permanent capital of Israel and over many other issues that we saw that we don't see eye to eye with the United States. We said no. And that is really a lot for Kuwaitis to say. Kuwait also, I will finish with this issue. Kuwait also probably is the only Arab country, and I had that on record, that there is a unanimous and consensus among the leadership, the Emir himself, the leadership, the parliament, the speaker of the parliament, who have been very hawkish about any normalization with the Israelis, and the public, mostly the public. All of them agree that Kuwait is not in the issue of normalization at this stage with Israel. There is no two-state solution. Nobody's not talking anymore about two-state solution. If you do not solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and with Netanyahu forming now probably the harshest and the most hardline cabinet in Israel history, you did away completely with the two-state solution when you gave them, when the Trump administration gave them Jerusalem and probably will give them more. For what? For nothing in return. I mean, what is the quid pro quo here? If you do not solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem, if you do not really act decisively on the Iranian plan B, what if Iran, 2 days from now, the sanctions will hit all the 8 countries that the United States gave them permission to sell, to receive Iranian oil, and this will be now slammed shut against these Chinese, the Indians, the Turks, and others. What is the alternative? Is there a plan B here? Is there a plan B? And how does that, now the Iranians are clamoring about shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. If our oil will not pass through, then your oil, you guys in the Gulf, especially those countries that will compensate the Iranian oil that will be shut out, the Saudis and the UAEs stepped into the plate. Then what? What if the Iranians ask their, proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen and others, to really direct attacks on some GCC countries or U.S. soldiers in Iraq or in Syria? And then what? Are we inching towards a war in our neck of the woods? All of that really plays into the minds of decision makers, of intelligentsia, and of the people in our region. So United States is a major player and shaker in the region. And what it does, and as I repeat, and what it doesn't do, especially what it does, especially with this administration, really, really is something that is of concern for everybody in our neck of the woods.
Thank you, Dr. Abdullah. So a very comprehensive view of the United States kind of pulling back from a mediation role in a lot of these different conflicts. And you gave us a reading list, so that's good. Dr. Jones, do you want to pick up maybe on the last point, the issue of Iran? Because this is a policy, of course, that has seen a lot of shift, a complete transformation from the posture of the Obama administration to the Trump administration. Obviously, Kuwait is a country that's right on the Gulf. Can you talk a little bit more about how Kuwait maybe views this issue and the challenges for Kuwait in particular, given its population and geographic posture?
Yeah, well, there's an easy one. First, I can't help, though, but make one comment I think that's very important, about Camp Arif-Jan and also about Al-Udeid. Because I think it's important to acknowledge what the real trade-off is here, and I think it's a pretty good one. It's about existential survival. And I recall a very dear friend who, from Qatar, who was involved in the negotiations, who was close to the family, of course, obviously, involved in the negotiations for Al-Udeid when I was there, when I was the director of the Arabian Peninsula. And we had been talking one day, and he, Raytheon had been trying to sell them PAC-3 and all of this kind of thing. And he said, look, Deborah, we have the strategic size of a peanut where we sit. He said, we don't need PAC-3 missile defense, because we'll be gone in an instant, in a heartbeat. We don't even have the space within our peninsula to, set it, to prevent it, because what those things do is they deflect. They don't necessarily destroy. They deflect the trajectory of missiles and things. And he said, and so what we are going to do for us strategically is to lash ourselves so closely to you in terms of having a base, the schools, universities here, businesses here, ties to the United States. It doesn't mean we're going to be like you, but we're going to have so many ties that it is in your interest to protect us, to defend us. And that is a classic approach from small, wealthy emirates and other places. And it's a legitimate approach. And if I were a ruler of an emirate, a small, wealthy emirate, I would do the same, because we all do it in one way or another. And in the case of Kuwait, I think that R.F. John has been a very small price to pay for the presence of a force there and an American presence there that has been very steadfast about, yes, it's been used, and I take your point on many things because I've had my own discussions with the American military, et cetera. But the fact is it's generated a lot of business for Kuwait as well, and whether it was through Agility before, which was a publicly shared company in Kuwait. The reality is that when you crunch the numbers, the Kuwaitis have actually benefited in many ways, large and small, from having the presence there. And I do think that they have been most Kuwaitis are surprised because the Americans have stayed out of sight. They've stayed over the horizon, which is what the leadership of Kuwait had asked for. And so I think that's important, too, that when you tell Kuwaitis, yeah, well, actually, we do have X, Y, and Z here, they're surprised by that. And that's how it should be, because that's the nature of the relationship, as long as we're working on other things together. So I would say that survival comes with high price, but I do agree with you that when we are not clear about what our lines are and where we allow them to be drawn, and we had this issue at one point when we had a move from our embassy in Baghdad to consider redrawing lines, on the UN agreed that we had been part of the negotiation of lines for Kuwait's northern boundaries. And this was an absolute red line for the Kuwaitis, and we made that very clear in our discussions that there are some things you cannot ask them to move on, no matter how many times Iraq or American officers or people who are protecting or defending or trying to promote Iraqi stability would say, but it's a very big country with a very small door. I mean, this is something you hear from Saddam, you heard it from Maliki, you're going to hear it from every Iraqi, because geography is geography, and location makes a difference. So Kuwait is in a very difficult spot that way. And so that brings me to the point of Iran and the relationship with Iran. And I always would convey to people, and this is just to keep you awake at the lunch hour, even though you've eaten, you may be having postprandial sleepiness. I once had a congressman, he was a representative from American Samoa, where, as you know, many of our troops come from Samoa. They would come and they were serving at Camp Arif John, and he's now deceased, but he had come to visit me one time in my office in Kuwait, and he's laid back, very relaxed fellow, and a lot of fun, and I could never pronounce his last name. It begins with an F. It's something like Falamagalu or whatever. Yeah, you can say it. Nick was his first name. And he was wearing Birkenstocks and socks. That I do remember. But he said, so tell me, Ambassador, he said, how do you explain this relationship of these Gulf countries with Iran? Because they had a lot of trade, still do. Some of them, they have a relationship. They have to have a relationship. The former prime minister was the dean of the diplomatic corps in Iran, speaks fluent Farsi. There is a population that naturally had migrated to Kuwait back in the day, both from what is now Iraq, what is now Iran. These are Arab, Shia, some of them, many of them, people who had moved from the Saudi areas, from the Nejd. And so Kuwait is a hybrid mix. And he said, but how do you explain they want us to protect, but they don't want us. What do they want from us on Iran? This was, of course, before the JICPOA, before the agreement. And I said, well, you know what they say, they live in the neighborhood, they have to get along with these guys. And I said, how the old saying goes, Congressman, when the elephants fight, the mice get trampled. And he said, well, let me tell you something, Ambassador. He said, I represent a very tiny island in the middle of the Pacific. surrounded by other countries who are much more important to the United States than we are, Japan, Australia, etc. He said, and let me tell you, when the elephants make love, it's not so good for the mice either. And, and I thought that was a brilliant politician's way of summing it up. And I said, that's exactly right. They don't want us to be too aggressive with Iran because they don't want to provoke a conflict that will consume Kuwait. They're right there. They also don't want us to allow a vacuum that Iran will fill easily. And that, frankly, for many of us was the beauty of the agreement and the arrangement with Iran. Now, you will find splits within the ruling family in Kuwait on how they feel about Iran and what kind of a danger it represents or does not. But here's where the brilliance, too, of the emir has been, I would say, and again, I'm a practitioner, I'm not an academic on this, but when I saw the one time that Peninsula Shield was triggered was when Bahrain was having issues. And many people were attributing it to the Iranians and provocations. And for me, it was very much like when civil rights movement in the United States was attributed to the Russians. The Russians knew how to climb on and exploit problems that we have. And the Iranians are very good at surfing in troubled waters, as one of our colleagues said, I think very astutely. But in this case, so there were those within the GCC who were calling on all of the countries to send troops. And in our conversations with the leadership, we said, but you have a Shia population that's very well integrated here, best integrated population in the Gulf. These are people who are productive. You don't want to have a problem. Well, we're not going to be actively out. We're going to be protecting places. Well, yeah, but if someone gets hurt who's a Shia, you're going to have a problem politically. The emir was out of the country initially, and he returned to the country. Well, what was the Kuwaiti solution? It was brilliant, and it was the Kuwaiti solution. It was, we will provide ships from Kuwait's Navy to keep an eye out to make sure no Iranians are approaching Bahrain. But that's it.
Made in Kuwait.
Made in Kuwait. That is exactly,
Branding.
yeah, that is the brilliance, and that is what one hopes and expects will come. Now, I will say, though, we're going to see the fissures because there are going to be pressures. As we go through transition in Kuwait, there will be pressures from other elements within the GCC who have different opinions. And we do have, and I will say this openly, and there's a vulnerability that Kuwaitis are going to have to keep an eye on, and that is your Article 4 within your constitution that has the parliament play a role in selecting a future emir. And you can bet, if it's like anything we've seen here in the United States with elections or in other places, in this world of cyber warfare or of money passing, there will be people who have an interest in influencing who the parliament selects. Now, again, strength of Kuwait, it's an intimate society. That kind of mischief won't remain covered long there. People will come forth. And I would say also that, in a funny way, it was a very Kuwaiti solution in the strength when we had when Sheikh Nasser Mohammed and Sheikh Ahmed Al-Fahd both had to leave for different reasons. I mean, there's a balance in everything there because it comes out in the wash. Anyway, sorry. Thank you.
Ambassador Ziadeh, maybe given your expertise and your service across the Gulf, we can turn a bit to the Gulf crisis. And I know you'll want to comment on this too since you have a book. But looking, you've talked about Kuwait's attempt to sort of preference, I guess, for mediating to some degree or finding simple solutions with Iran. Is there a chance for Kuwait to do that in the current Gulf crisis, where we see the Gulf itself divided amongst countries with Qatar on one side and the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain along with Egypt on another side? So.
Well, I think it's important to note that while you have the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain on one side, and then you have Qatar on the other, you have Oman and Kuwait not throwing their lot in with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain. And in fact, by and large, Kuwait and Oman has supported Qatar certainly economically, in providing avenues for trade, transshipment, air corridors, etc., to help Qatar weather the economic onslaught that was brought about when all the borders were closed, the airspace was closed, because these two countries also have had historically tensions with their GCC neighbors on different issues, whether it's borders, whether it's production of oil, like in the neutral zone, whether it's where the lines are drawn. I mean, the Omani-Saudi border has historically had tensions. And also different ways of looking at how you rule the country and where your legitimacy stems. Oman, and I see our colleague here from the embassy. I mean, Oman is a very different society, even religiously, in terms of how they think, their history, their ties to Africa, to the subcontinent in terms of trade. So these are, even as personalities, people would say to me, but the GCC is all one. And I go, 6 very, very different personalities, histories, leaderships that shape the sort of realpolitik of the country, how they see themselves and how they go forward. So in the GCC, to be able to say sort of there's a clear line drawn, I think is not an accurate read of history, which we in the West, we like to put everything in very nice, neat boxes and assume it's always been so. And the fact of the matter is that disputes even, let's say, between Saudi Arabia and the UAE have had a long history. That border near the Shaiba oil field is one that I suspect we will see come to the fore again, even though theoretically it's been decided, but I don't know, we'll see. And so the fact that there are these tensions has been historic. And Kuwait has played a historic role, even, let's say, going back to tensions between Saudi Arabia and Qatar in the early 2000s. I mean, the Saudis didn't even have an ambassador in Qatar for like 6-7 years in the early 2000s over some difficulties. And so this is a constant theme. Yes, it is probably a worse situation now in terms of the tensions. I suspect it's going to continue for a while because there doesn't seem to be any real flexibility on the part of either party, but particularly, I would have to say, in terms of the UAE and the Saudis, who've pretty much taken a very, very strict line and don't seem to want to have any flexibility. The Qataris have sort of managed economically to weather the storm and seem to be on a much stronger footing economically. They're still sort of trying to figure out their way in terms of the dynamics with the other countries in the region, particularly with Iran. But that's always been an ongoing issue because of their shared oil field. And one could argue that there are other countries in the GCC that have much stronger economic, social, marriage, trading ties with Iran than Qatar has, which actually historically has had very little. So I don't think that the issue is going to be solved in the short run. I think it'll be interesting to see how things work out in terms of the World Cup that's coming up in 2022. Whether the league is going to expand the number of teams, and if so, are those teams going to go to Kuwait and Oman, which is what has been suggested? I mean, we don't know yet.
No.
Yeah, we don't know
Kuwait,
yet.
no. Not in Kuwait.
We'll see. It has been suggested by FIFA, so we'll see whether Kuwait decides to do that or not.
Heard it here first.
Yeah, we heard it here first. Or if they decide to stick to the same number of teams, and therefore the whole thing can be done in Qatar. But there are a number of opportunities for a bit of rapprochement. We just haven't seen them. We know, for example, that there were some recent military exercises that took place in Riyadh. The Qataris were there and were represented. And the military sometimes has a way of just doing things in a very narrow focus of, all right, put politics aside, here's the military, here's what we're doing. And that was successful. But I also wonder how much the U.S., shall we say, said these are our exercises and therefore we will sort of determine we need to have these people at the table. And I suspect it was a bit of a concession. But again, those are small steps that I think can be meaningful in a longer-term strategy. But for the short term, I don't see any lessening of the situation because of the lines that have been drawn and the fact that the Qataris have weathered the storm, at least up until now.
I want to get to questions, and we haven't even gotten to a lot of Kuwaiti domestic politics, but I wanted to give you one opportunity. Maybe if you could just answer briefly, Dr. Abdullah. We look at the U.S. strategy right now, the priority of the Trump administration clearly in the Middle East, maybe two legs. Maybe we can talk about Israel, but you've already spoken about Israel. But clearly maximum pressure on Iran. And we do have, obviously, the role of these more empowered Gulf states now. How do these politics play out inside of Kuwait? Because we know Kuwait has a much more open political system. How do these sorts of divisions play out inside of the country?
Regarding the issue of Iran, Kuwait has been always on the side that Iran is a major player in the region. All other countries in the GCC, they also share that view. And you don't want to provoke Iran. Iran doesn't face you head on. Iran does not confront you face to face. Iran confronts you through its proxies, through its soft power, through the Iraqis, through the Lebanese, through the Yemenis, through even in a way that we discovered 4 years ago, the most dangerous and the largest terrorist cell that the Iranians trained, indoctrinate, armed with Hezbollah, and it was discovered in Kuwait. 26 members of that cell, 25 Kuwaitis, Shia, and 1 Iranian, and they were tried for over 2 years, and a couple of them were sentenced to death. One of them was an Iranian national who was in absentia, was sentenced in absentia. Iran, under the Obama administration, with his obsession with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was allowed, from Iranian perspective, and the mullahs in Iran, Ayatollahs, to dominate, and they keep bragging about it, 4 Arab capitals: Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and Sana'a. And their shenanigans and meddling in the Kuwaiti, Saudi, Emirati, Qatari, Bahraini affairs is well documented, even by their embassies. Embassy staff members and diplomats were involved. So the Iran is a major player that we do not want to. It's like the elephant. Mm-hmm. It's the elephant in the room that you cannot ignore, but you don't want to provoke, and you want to keep at bay. And Kuwait was, after the GCC summit in Bahrain, I think it was 3 years ago, December, Kuwait was asked to be the mediator, the GCC liaisoning with the Iranians about the rapprochement after the sacking of the Saudi embassy in Tehran and their general consulate in Mashhad after Saudi Arabia executed Nimr and others in January 2016. So Kuwait is looked upon by the Iranians as a go-between and accepted mediator, but that really went nowhere, as was expected, because the Iranians have a project. And their project is to be the dominant power, the hegemonic power in the region, in order to have leverage and to trade it with the Americans and Europeans on their way to become a nuclear power. And the Obama administration understood that. And they played along. And then you had the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Then came Trump. And he stuck to the deal, even though he kept repeating when he was running for president and his campaign trail that it was the worst deal ever and he will tear it apart. He kept it for over a year, and then he pulled out last May, and then he hit Iran with the harshest sanctions. And then now what? This is the issue, once again. Kuwait is, I was I read recently a study by Washington Institute for Near East Policy by David Pollack, Kuwaiti views, to answer your question. Maybe you saw that. Sunni Kuwaitis view Hezbollah 2% favorably. Shia Kuwaitis view Hezbollah 11% favorably. Even Shia, they have not that great view of Hezbollah. Sunni Kuwaitis view Hamas 52%. Shia Kuwaitis view Hamas 52%. Kuwait is, as I said, Kuwait is a vibrant society. They have more tolerance than most Arab world society. The relationship between Sunni Shia is still, even though it's under heavy stress because of the rise of sectarianism in the neighborhood and in the Arab world as a whole, because of the Iranian involvement, shenanigans, and meddling. Even though Kuwaiti Shia, by and large, I would say that they are not into the business of creating troubles. The 25 Shiite who were arrested and who were tried and who were also indicted do not represent the Shi'i population, in my opinion. There is more accommodation and there is more allowance for the Shiite. In parliament, they have like 6 parliamentarians. They have well-to-do in the society. They are middle class and they are well represented in the civil society.
Questions, if that's okay. I'm going to go to questions. Thank you. I'm going to go to questions. If we have a microphone that will come along so that we can catch that for the live stream as well. If you can please just introduce yourself and ask your question. And I'm going to take a couple because we don't have a ton of time and I want to make sure we get as many questions as possible. So Bushra here in the front.
We keep hearing from the Arab side, especially in the Gulf, that the U.S. is pulling out, that the U.S. is retrenching. But if you look at the facts, we have 11,000 to 14,000 Americans in Iraq. We have 11,000 Americans in Kuwait. We have 6,000 Americans in the UAE. We have the American Navy in Bahrain. We have the American base in Qatar. That doesn't indicate to me that the U.S. is pulling out. We heard that in the last 2 years of the Obama administration. We keep hearing it about Trump. But as long as the U.S. has so many troops, that doesn't indicate to me that the U.S. is going to walk out.
Thank you. We have another question back there.
It's not a question, it's a
If you can
comment and
introduce yourself,
request.
please.
Ali Al-Kandari from Kuwait University. You've talked in a positive way with some negatives on the Kuwaiti model, which is, I think it's good to promote the Kuwaiti model in the GCC. From a Kuwaiti perspective, and I think, promoting this model in the GCC would be really important for not just Kuwaitis, but for the whole region. My request is for Western American experts, because they listen to you more than they do for us, is to have an advice, a good advice, and the same advice which Mr. Ambassador Gnaim, when he gave to Kuwaiti government in Taif during 1990 crisis, is to bring back democracy in the Jeddah conference. It's a long story, but I'm cutting it short. To promote democracy, to promote more tolerance, and please, promoting the Kuwaiti model is not only good for Kuwait, but it's good for the whole region, and also it's good for the American interests in the region, having a more stable societies, more stable governments. It's important. It's good for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Hussein Ibish, I'm a scholar here at AGSIW. I'm noted with interest that towards the end of last year, Kuwait signed a military cooperation agreement with Turkey. And this at a time when Turkey's presence in the Arab Gulf countries is intensifying, its relationship with Qatar is intensifying, and many people in the region, including many people in the other Gulf countries, see Turkey as an emerging new pole in the region, as the leader of a third camp, so to speak, along with a pro-American and a pro-Iranian camp. So I'm wondering what you see going on here. In other words, is this a way for Qatar to maximize its options? What's its general attitude? Does it not share this analysis? And sorry, for Kuwait, that's right. And to maximize its options. And does it not share this analysis? And what does Kuwait think it's doing exactly in reaching out to Turkey at this stage and under these circumstances? And behind that comes the general issue of the relationship Kuwait has with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. I know.
Okay, let's go ahead. Deborah, we have a question on the table about the still extensive U.S. presence? I think was to you, Ambassador Deborah.
Yeah. Okay, I would just say briefly, Uda, that the U.S. Never leaves a place where it goes. I mean, we have bases extensively in Western Europe, in Korea, in all kinds of places, and it doesn't mean that we're active in their policies the way we used to be. And so I think that these are real assets that we have out there, and they're seen that way. And we actually, in the case of Arif Jan, we own the real estate. But the question is, what do we use it for, and what does our presence do there? So I would say that the missions have changed, and it's probably supporting more. Not out there. I'm just not close enough to know anymore. But I think all I can measure is what we say publicly, and whether it shows that we're actually interested in supporting status quo, or whether we're kind of suggesting that we don't really care. Because again, with these comments on the Muslim Brotherhood, I mean, did anyone give thought to what that means for a diverse society like Kuwait that has Islamists or Muslim Brotherhood who are in their parliament? The same thing when you get in, it's the complexity with Lebanon. The same thing, I mean, Bahrain, I mean, and the fact that they have this presence there. And so I think there is this lack of focus somehow, and whether it's just at the very top here or whether it is so narrowly transactionally focused on something else, the result is the same, that we may have presence, but we're not exercising a leadership presence the way we used to. And talking about GCC unity, I don't see that the U.S., I mean, we gave some lip service, but you had open disagreement within the U.S. administration between our Secretary of State prior and the President on how to, and defense and everyone else on how we deal with this. So that's the problem. And I think it's important not to confuse, military presence with political assertion of leadership, maybe.
Dr. Abdullah, do you want to take up the question? Sorry, we need to get to the other two questions before we get another question.
I agree with Deborah.
Do you want to take up the question of Turkey, please?
Oh, God, the Middle East, yes. Well, that's
We'll get you in the next round of questions. Dr. Abdullah,
Okay,
do you want to
thank
take up
you.
the question of Turkey?
Yeah, I agree with Deborah, and there is a difference between presence and resolve, presence and action, presence and really the gut feeling that you are there to deliver, and you're not there just to serve your own interest. All the countries that you stated in Kuwait and in Qatar and Bahrain, it serves the U.S. CENTCOM theater of operation, rather than only protecting and safeguarding the countries that they are in. And this is the reason why Kuwait, to tie the three questions together in one thread, if I may, because of that, there is now a splintering GCC, because of the GCC crisis, because the Trump administration has not really exercised its leadership role in solving the longest and the severest and the most damaging crisis that befall its own allies in the region. It's now coming to 2 years. Where is the United States? It's missing. Where is the summit that was supposed to take place? US GCC summit in Camp David or in Washington since last May. Never materialized. And then Trump administration comes and tell us, well, we need MESA, Middle East Strategic Alliance. Great. How could you do that before solving all these crises? Before you have a coherent policy vis-a-vis Iran, before you have a doctrine of who is the enemy and how to fight this enemy. Then again, why are we now approaching, or we have a more alliance or more dealing with the Turks, and the Kuwaitis? Not only the Turks, I might add also the Brits. Britain is now thinking seriously of building a naval base in Kuwait in the next few years, because we're hedging our bets. After what we saw happen to Qatar, there are 11,000, to add to Deborah's point and to answer also your point. Why would the Qataris go to the Turks after the crisis erupted in June 2017 and asked them to activate and expedite the military agreement with Turkey to send a few thousand of its soldiers to Al-Udeid Air Force Base outside Doha, while Qatar is hosting the Americans, who have 11,000 strong personnel, military personnel, and Air Force personnel on its land. What kind of message is the U.S. sending here? Why didn't at that time, President Trump, instead of tweeting, they pointed at Qatar and firing later on Rex Tillerson with a tweet? Why didn't he stood up and say, well, no change of the status quo. What's going on is unacceptable, it has to stop. That message was resounded strongly all over the Gulf, that the United States is not reliable when push comes to shove, probably. So let's hedge our bets and let's have coordination and not security agreement with the Turks. More coordination, more military and security and interior ministry delegation will go and come, defense ministry officials will go and come to show that we are interested in hedging our bets and having another layer of protection. The same thing with the Brits. I would expect that 10 years down the road, we're going to have an internationalization of Gulf security. It's not only the Americans going to be the only kid on the block. We're going to have the Chinese, the Indians, the Koreans, the Russians probably. If the United States continue not only to retrench, but also not to act when it should act, to safeguard its own interest and its allies' interest who don't cost United States taxpayers a penny.
Can I just follow up, because I'm curious, is there a danger or a different kind of danger in kind of hedging in this way with Turkey? We know that Turkey has a more intimate relationship with a lot of the politics in the region, and right now today we have a number of former parliamentarians that were sentenced that are now in Turkey, and you do have increasing numbers of sort of Kuwait opposition figures that are in Turkey. Is this an issue that Kuwait needs to be concerned about?
Well, for us, Turkey seems to be more a benign ally than anything else. By the way, the latest statistics show that Kuwaitis are the number one percentage-wise tourists to visit Turkey than any other GCC country. There's, I don't know.
They follow Muhammad on the TV.
The Turkish soap opera has been stopped, by the way, from running an MBC, which is a Saudi-owned network. So the Kuwaitis have love affair, it seems, with the Turks. And I was just in Istanbul last month, and it's really a lovely city. Those who visit Turkey, I mean, it's really lovely and ancient, and But Turkey is a rising star regional player that has interest. It has a project. It wants to be the leader of the Sunni region, it seems, and it has also relations with the Americans. Problem with the Americans, and relations with the Iranians. So it's really a funny mix, or a very strange mix but the Kuwaitis look at Turkey in a benign way and could be, as I said, an added layer of protection and support, and it doesn't hurt to have others. We have with NATO also, by the way, ICI, Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, since 2004. Which is another layer also of the using NATO expertise, but it doesn't add much. But I'm saying to diversify not only your economy, but your allies.
Mm-hmm. Can I add one? Sure. Turkey has been very smart in how they've played in terms of the GCC on trade, on development, Turkish companies everywhere in terms of construction. You don't walk into an office building without seeing the furniture.
They're building the new Kuwaiti airport.
I mean, the construction companies
and your embassy
have been all over the Gulf. And there is definitely a trade relationship, even in terms of foodstuffs, some labor, but mostly trade that has been important. And the issue of having the Turks, whether it was in Qatar, which actually that agreement predated the tension, but of course was, as you correctly noted, escalated more quickly when the threats came on the borders with Saudi Arabia. But the fact of the matter is, and I just want to put this small footnote, historically, there still is in the Gulf, even though they never were 100% formally under the Ottoman Empire, there is still in the back of people's minds, ever so slightly, the term Ottoman still comes up. It's not Turkish, it's Ottoman. And for example, in Saudi Arabia, when the Ottomans defeated the Saud, the Second Kingdom in the northern part, or were in cahoots with the Al Rashid against the Al Saud, you see historical remnants of Turkish and Ottoman intervention in ways that was sometimes inimical to at that time there weren't really states, but shall we say tribal groupings, city-states, whatever the term is, for these countries. So while the trade is there, the religion obviously is the same. It has been helpful in terms of the military. One cannot deny the technical know-how and the economy of Turkey. I just would caution it with a very small footnote that memories are long in the region, and that's the only thing I would mention.
Let me just P.S. Kuwait is a Turkish word. Kuwait, it's a little Turkish. It's anyway, sorry. I just, having served in Istanbul, have to make that point.
Yeah, and just one other observation. I think the reference to the Ottomans is not just subtle and quiet, but very overt in Saudi Arabia today, where there's a lot more growing concern about that. Let's take another round of questions, please.
Marlene Davis with Motorola Solutions. I was wondering whether you could maybe talk a little bit about the MESA initiatives and maybe the Turkey-Qatar relationships when Qatar came to Turkey's rescue when their currency dropped. Maybe discuss a little bit, the relationship of Turkey, Russia with the S-400 and how that all affects the GCC relationship with Turkey and the U.S.
This is a lecture.
Whoa.
It's a complex one,
You
yeah.
need a lecture.
Let's just take one more question. Does anyone have another? We've kind of given short shrift to domestic Kuwaiti politics. Does anyone have a question about or a comment about the domestic situation in Kuwait? No. Anything to add? No, we'll pick it up. No other questions? All right. Well, let's unravel then this very difficult question that was just given to us. You want to start?
Good heavens. Okay, where to begin on this? The U.S., because this is really all about the U.S.-Turkish relationship, isn't it? Which is it's always been, like all long-term relationships and many marriages, very complicated. And there's a lot of emotion packed into it on the Turkish side in particular. And I think there was a lot of unhappiness on the Turkish side that in Syria, that what began as a tactical alliance between U.S. military and Kurds became somehow morphed into a strategic approach, which the Turks found very offensive. And very hurtful for them because, after all, we're the wife, aren't we? Are we not? We're a NATO ally. And, of course, one could go back and easily question the NATO alliances or why they were a NATO alliance in the past, why, because it actually was tied so much into Cold War. But I think that has this competition right now between, look, Turkey's always been part of the prize. As the U.S. has looked out at the region and the Russians have looked out at the region, you have some major, you have Iran, you have Turkey, and you have the Iraq. And then you had before kind of the Arabian Peninsula down here, but now these players on the Arabian Peninsula are saying, hey, you know what, we want to displace, or we'd like to, we're doing what you'd like us to do in some ways, in other ways not. But there's a kind of an energy coming out of the peninsula that seeks to change that dynamic that's always been there. I mean, whether it was Baghdad Pact in the old days or whatever, we've always had our focus on these big demographic centers of that are actually have long histories, big militaries, are very organized as in terms of their military and societies and everything. So. Look, with Turkey, we have also, we just had a shakeup in the election there, but I think that the Erdogan's view has increasingly been that he's not only a Turkish secular, a Turkish leader, he is a Sunni leader. And part of his success in being elected in the first place was that he kind of allowed Turks to loosen the taps a little bit on what had been a society, and this is, again, personal opinion, having served there, but, when you think about what Ataturk did, ironically, in Turkey, he wrenched them so hard to the West that he actually cut off history for a number of Turks, and it was a very awkward, and it was really only the elites, whether it was in the military in Ankara or his followers or the elites in Istanbul, who were very comfortable with kind of a rejection of their Islamic past. But when you think about it, you had Turks who couldn't read the correspondence of their grandparents because he torqued, there was such torque in all of that. Having said that, though, the irony, and I think people need to remember this too, that ironically Ataturk, in expelling the minorities, the Christian minorities, the Armenians, or dealing with the people who were in there after World War I, and because of unhappiness, remember this all gets into ancient history for many people, but that by making Turkey Turkic and Turkish, an identity that was Turkish, he made it a Muslim country, ipso facto. Because you got rid of the Greeks who were Christians, you got rid of the Armenians who were Christians, the Jewish community was, they were kind of kept in place in Istanbul. So there's a huge irony there that in making it secular and non, and getting, this predates previous things, but ridding it of foreigners, he made it both Turkic, and Islamic. And so Erdogan, I think, saw his role as kind of making it natural for Turks to be Muslims instead of being prohibited by the secular laws of the state. Now, where that goes into, his own power game and everything else, but clearly the threat that represents then to others, and because you have a democratic Muslim state. Now, there are some people who would tell you that that there's an important and essential difference between having a hereditary state of an Islamic character and having a democratic Muslim state. One is dangerous for some people, that becomes the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And the other one is acceptable, and that's the Madkhali. And this competition is going on now between people who have taken traditional roles, and I would say Qatar is one, of co-opting those elements that are Muslim brother or want change. You find a way to buy them into the system, and the Turks would say that too, whereas you have the other side that says you must eradicate because they are going to infest your society and will inexorably lead to your overthrow. So it becomes existential on the one side, and I think we have to view it in our, look, I have often said to people, I see nothing happening in the Middle East these days that you can't see something in the American playbook. Whether it was against communism or against, civil rights movement in the United States or anything that we thought was going to upend our status quo, or war by mercenary or getting involved in other governments. I mean, we've actually created a pretty good book, people can go to episodes of our history because we're transparent, and then we criticize ourselves and we try to self-correct and stuff. But the fact is, there are very few things that you can say we've not done in terms of dynamics in power plays and et cetera.
Thank you. Of course, the United States is a lot larger country and more kind of insulated than a lot of these smaller countries that are very much in the midst of all these countries.
True, but I would say that social media has thrown off power politics
we didn't
everywhere,
get to that
and you with Motorola, you should never forget that. It's quite remarkable. Libya's at war, and we can still follow it every day on WhatsApp with our friends there and social media. This is. No, I know. You're radio.
Excellent point. Well, we're out of time. If you bear with us, maybe just give 1 minute to each of our panelists. Please make it very brief, knowing that we're out of time. But if there's any last comment or something that you heard from the audience, we didn't get much discussion about the resilience of Kuwaiti democracy and a role model or any of these other issues that were brought up. If you want one last comment before we close.
Well, just briefly, Kuwait democracy, I think it's a model to be emulated, although it's under stress, and many, probably even intellectuals in the Gulf countries and even maybe leadership would look at Kuwait democracy as a prototype that is not suitable for probably expediting modernization and bickering. If you don't want a job done, then you have a Kuwait democracy, and all the fighting and bickering between the government and the parliament, which at the end of the day does not really deliver as the people like. But at the end of the day also, you cannot have really a viable, sustainable system without democracy and the opinion of the people to be counted. Frontier states will delay this, but at the end of the day, you will have the people saying. And Kuwait has really, could be a harbinger and a prototype, as I stated in my PhD dissertation at the University of Texas back 30 years ago, that Kuwait could play a major role for its, indigenous neighbors. When they, like Bahrain, when they decided to have a constitution and a parliament, where did they go? They went to Kuwait. And even they picked the same name, Majlis al-Ummah al-Bahraini, 1971. Now it's Majlis al-Nawab. But at the end, Kuwait is a good model to be emulated in many aspects. The other point is that Turkey represents an axis in our neighborhood, an axis that would stretch to the Ikhwan, stretch to Qatar, and it has, as I said, a project to play versus other projects that is really looked at Turkey as a menacing threat, with supporting Al-Ikhwan against the status quo in the Arab world, especially in Egypt and other, and maybe Saudi Arabia, and look with suspicion about, and even UAE with suspicion about the project, the Turkish project, the Ottomans, the new Ottomans even now is the term that is being used in a derogatory manner in order to fend off against the approaching Turks and the Persian Iranians. But we don't have a project. The GCC was the only hope, the Arab hope, after the collapse of Egypt, of Syria, of Iraq, the center and the peripheries in the strategic studies. The center has fallen in Egypt and Iraq and Syria. The GCC became a de facto leader of the Arab world, of the Arab political system. We saw that in Libya, we saw that in Yemen. But then we have the Gulf crisis, the GCC crisis, that really collapsed the last hope for any kind of a project that could embryonically spring out of this mess.
Dr. Abdullah, you don't count the Saudi, Emirati, Egyptians as a project, an Arab project?
The Saudi Emirati they have a good project.
They have a project.
Plus they have now the coordination council, the Saudi Emirati coordination council that sprang out of the GCC on December 5th, 2018 or 17, sorry, when Kuwait hosted the GCC summit, the 38th GCC summit. On the same evening, or the dawn of that day, it was announced everybody was surprised, the Saudi Emirati Coordination Council, decisive project that will really intertwine and coordinate between these two largest economy in the Arab world. Total economy of Saudi Arabia, UAE, would exceed $1 trillion. And they believe that they have a story to tell, and they have a project to extend to many regions in the Arab world.
Kuwait and Saudi Arabia also have a coordination council, but we won't go into that now.
But it's not as effective as...
I think we're really running out of time, but just really briefly, Ambassador Jones and Ambassador Ziadeh.
I'll yield to Susan since I've been pontificating.
Okay.
Well, really, I think everything has been said. The one thing that I would say is I think Kuwait does serve as a model, and the fact that it's been there for so long and continues on its path. I think before the fall of Saddam, Kuwait was hesitant. Hesitant in terms of its own, not its identity, but its own landmass, feeling vulnerable, not wanting to invest in its country. You see, I think, a different Kuwait since the fall of Saddam, still, dealing with forces in the region, but you even see it physically when you go into the country, a sort of renewed energy and a renewed sense of vigor, and the next generation of young people who are educated in the leadership roles. And so I think that it's a good future and can serve as a good model for the region.
Thank you. So join me all in thanking our panelists, and thanks to all of you for coming. Really appreciate your attention.